Hi everyone, and thank you very much for coming along this evening. This has been put on by Midlothian Matters in association also with Women for Independence in Midlothian. Just to give you a quick insight about Midlothian Matters, basically through our Women for Independence meetings locally, we came across that there's not a kind of umbrella really being an advocate and a voice for Midlothian and what's happening. So we've kind of got two sides to it at the moment. We've got the side where we're looking at, well, what is there any issues in Midlothian? Is there anything we want to look at? And we've got the other side, which is looking at the small groups and the fantastic community things that are already going on that haven't really got a voice, and not a lot of people know about it. So we decided that we're going to kind of be that voice for lots of areas in Midlothian. So today we're going to be passing over post-it notes, and the question is, what matters to you in Midlothian? So anything that you want at all, if you're able to write on that and pop it up on our tree at the back, and we're going to collect that information, and really we want people in Midlothian to have that voice. So that's a little bit about us this evening. I'm going to pass over to Mary, who will introduce our speakers for tonight. Thank you.
Hi everybody, welcome, and thank you very much to those contributors who put their hands in their pockets to pay for the venue. I'm grateful. There is no fire alarm plan as far as I'm aware, so if it does go off, please make for the exits, which are downstairs, I think. Is there another one over there, Chairman? Downstairs. Okay. Don't get caught in the stairs, please. So I'd like to introduce Jen and Charlotte from the Scottish Land Action Movement, who've been campaigning for change as far as the land is concerned, and of course Andy Wightman, author, journalist and consultant, researcher, who's come to have his lunch. So please forgive me being on the go all day. I don't know if all of you know, but the Scottish Government asked a lot of people, or put it out for consultation about land, and those consultation documents needed to be back in by February, and there was a lot of us, Women for Independence included, who were scrabbling at the last minute trying to give a response to this consultation document. And it was a real eye-opener, because whenever anybody thinks about land reform, you think about big estates. What you don't think about is the brown fields, land grabbing by big supermarkets, building on the green belt, social housing. All of these things tend to get kind of, you know, in the morass of all the issues that are out there. So the Scottish Land Action Movement, Andy, the Radical Independence Collective, Women for Independence, all put in a submission to that consultation document. And the process raised many expectations and many questions that will probably go unresolved for years, but what it did do is highlight for me the whole issue about local development plans. Now, there's some of you may be aware that Midlothian Council will be putting out their own development plan after the general election. And our hope is that by raising a lot of the issues through this venue tonight and asking people to read about land reform, that they will then be able to, within their own communities, raise issues about the local plans. So tonight's talk will inform us about all of these issues, and I'd just like to hand you over. I take it you two ladies are going first? Yes? Great. Jan and Charlotte, thanks.
Hello, can everyone hear me okay?
No.
Can I project my voice? Yeah?
No.
No? Stand up. Can people hear me now? So we are Scottish Land Action Movement. We're an organisation that was set up in December as a means of creating what we hope is a countrywide network of land reform activists and campaigners, and to provide a source of education on all things land reform.
Our website contains a library of resources and a blog which publishes articles and stories from people and organisations across the country who are working on furthering land reform in Scotland. Whether they be community woodlands or community gardens in urban areas, Post-Referendum Scotland is a place where people will not go back in their box. Land reform is a process that has been long overdue. Most people are now aware of the figures of 432 landowners owning half of Scotland's private land, and I think we can all agree that this is very rarely beneficial to anyone except for the owners themselves. Without an up-to-date land register, finding out who owns what is completely hit and miss, and the disconnect from not owning the land that they live on means that the vast majority of Scots feel powerless when it comes to decisions on things like development or land use change. Local voices are often not being heard and are often completely left out of decisions that will affect the way they live their lives. Our common good land is being sold off without our knowledge. Just a few weeks ago, it was revealed that Parliament House, an area of common good land in Edinburgh, just off the Royal Mile, had been allowed to be sold off to a faculty of advocates by the government with barely whisper. If not for Andy Wightman is here, it's unlikely that any of us would have known. And this theft of our land is not an uncommon occurrence. And it's happening because we don't know about it. It's happening because we felt removed from the land for such a long time. I remember talking to Heather Anderson, one of the owners of Wightman Farm in the Borders, which is trying to become the first community-owned farm in Scotland. She said it took her 3 years to realise the extent of the land she bought and to walk around the entire perimeter, because she had never owned any land before or had known anybody else who had owned it either. This fundamental disconnect from land disenfranchises us, and we are trying to be the movement that changes that.
We're doing a bit of a punch and judy right here, sorry. So I'm Jen Stout, I'm part of SLAM. Did anyone listen to your morning call on Radio Scotland? So I was listening to this morning, and it wasn't funny, it was really tragic, but they asked people to phone in with their views on the planning system. It sounds quite dry, right? But they were totally inundated with calls of like just deep frustration and disempowerment and anger. It was really, it was really impressive. And as part of my official job is I work with 38 Degrees, and we were helping to run a campaign in Argyll and Butte for Castle Tower. There's a community buyout. And this is like this massive, beautiful castle and this big estate, which is now lying empty and costing the taxpayer like thousands in maintenance because it's owned by the council. This is despite a really impressive and detailed community buyout bid, which would have seen the property turned into like a job-creating, community-boosting hub of activity, but the council refused to sell for less than £1 million over the asking price, and basically treated the community abysmally the entire way through this process, and are now being investigated for their conduct, which is one thing, but it was really eye-opening. And again, it's not a rural issue, so in Glasgow, the last sort of remnants of public space that we have in the city centre, which is increasingly gentrified, are being systematically removed, being replaced by glass-plated private spaces where like, you can be a shopper, but you can't be a busker, you can't be a protester, you can't be a loiterer, you know. And so the outcry when Glasgow City Council proposed, or developer proposed demolishing the Buchanan Street steps outside the Royal Concert Hall, which is a really popular gathering point. There's this huge outcry, and we had a campaign with 16,000 signatures, over 300 handwritten objections, and a huge rally. None of this mattered, none of it. And last week the council voted to demolish the steps anyway. And yet again, the public consultation was really minimal. Like no one would have known this was happening if it weren't for a few young campaigners who I got to work with who made such a big noise about this. And we held street stalls and people were literally just mobbing us, being like, what are they doing? You know, what's even going on? Why don't I know about this? So, the council seemingly didn't really want a public consultation, they were listening to the developer far more. Their evidence was based on the developer's report they had written saying that the steps had little value. And what in this situation, what real power did people have to object for such a huge campaign to make no difference? It leaves people with a really bitter taste in their mouth, I think, and a very cynical view of their local authority. And the council can say that people make Glasgow, and clearly it's not true. And like with these two examples and many, many others, land is at the heart of these issues, of these controversies. Ownership is important because it tends to dictate the use, which is really what matters. What the issue is what the land and the buildings upon it are used for. So is it used for private profit or social gain, which thing wins out? And there's just communities all across Scotland that are absolutely full of talented, imaginative people who have brilliant ideas for things that they want to do with the land that they have and their resources. And it is insane that they find it so hard and sometimes completely impossible to implement even small scale. Sorry?
People can't hear at the back.
Well, this is as loud as I go, I'm quite weak.
Sorry.
So people can't even implement the very small scale and common sense ideas that they have in their local communities. So this is a ridiculous situation that I think everyone's familiar with. And I know that there's a situation now in Midlothian with the proposed film studios and the Inspiring Capital. I see on their website today, I was trying to find out about this, and they seem to be sort of promoting the attached hotel as an investment opportunity before the full planning application has even been made, let alone consulted on. So no wonder people all over Scotland are suspicious about the reality of whether they can influence developments in their area or not. I mean, we're really interested to hear from folk about this afterwards in the Q&A about their thoughts on this development. So I mean, yeah, the heart of these problems is land use and ownership. You know, whose rights matter the most, and why are people always walking away from consultations feeling so frustrated and so disempowered? And is this planning system even remotely fit for purpose?
I think true radical land reform will be a lengthy process. It's not something that will happen overnight, but it doesn't mean we can't start fighting back now. The planning system is dense and weighted in favour of developments who have the time and resources and money to force through their own interests, but there are many examples of communities across the country who are reclaiming back their land. One of these examples is called Halmire. It's a community project in the Borders that is looking to turn a failed building site owned by RBS into a community village. Much of the area suffers from a lack of affordable housing, which means young people on low wages are being forced out of their own area and away from their families just so they can find somewhere to live, and that's not acceptable. When the recession ground the RBS plans to a halt, the site was just left to rot. However, a group of local people got together and decided to take RBS on. They envisaged a green community housing project with affordable housing and green spaces based on a distinctive community-centric model, which involved building a central house in the middle of the project for various group activities. And they used a community right to buy, which was introduced as part of the Land Reform Scotland Act of 2003, and they submitted a proposal to the Scottish Government in order to register an interest in the land, and the Scottish Government agreed on this. It all seemed to be running smoothly until RBS decided to take the government to court over the ruling, which was frankly incomprehensible given that they had been losing money on the site and they had been wanting someone to take the site off their hands. But here was an opportunity for them to do so, and they decided to turn their backs on local democracy. The final decision on this court ruling is still up in the air, but the group has been told that all signs point to a positive verdict for the project. So the community village will go full steam ahead with engagement with local people at every level, and something exciting and innovative to look forward to in terms of land use and ownership. But it shouldn't be exciting and innovative. It should be normal. Community land ownership has seen several success stories throughout Scotland in places like Egg and Knoydart, I'm sure you're aware. But stumbling blocks such as lack of information on land ownership and complicated planning processes mean that wading through the amount of paperwork and legal guidelines is practically a full-time job. The Halmire Group are dedicated and unwavering, but so often we see the big businesses and developments win out. This has to change. Local people who know their area are much more likely to know what's best for it, and getting involved in planning decisions and thwarting unwanted development is a key step in mobilising ourselves. Education on all aspects of land reform legislation is incredibly important. Knowledge is power, and the power to change things will only come if we take it. We want Scottish Land Action Movement to be a facilitator for this change, to educate and inspire. But it is only by working together that we can bring about radical and comprehensive land reform. It's amazing what people can do when they feel like they can bring about change to their own future. And there's currently actually a crowdfunding campaign for the Isle of Arran Community Land Initiative. They were awarded a grant from the Scottish Land Fund, and they were able to buy a plot of land. And they now plan to turn it into an active space for recreation, growing food sustainably, and providing activities for families. The possibilities for the land are endless. It doesn't have to be big businesses and development or empty barren lands.
So basically, Andy knows all of the information and lots of history, and we're sort of here to talk about the activism that we can do right now as well. And it's what's been happening in the last few months has been, I mean, really interesting. Since the land reform agenda has been announced by the Scottish Government, and it ties in with the referendum. And one of the things that I always heard when I was growing up in Shetland was don't try and change anything, because you'll just never win, right? And this, I have this echoing in my head, it's my granny's voice saying this, right? And then that was their experience, because they lived in a very rigid system of ownership, of land ownership, and total powerlessness, really. And one of the things I noticed during the referendum was that this ingrained powerlessness was lifted away, and at all ages, but especially for young people. And I think what's hard to watch is when they just hit brick walls. And these brick walls are, you know, our democratic structures are flawed, our legislation is weak, there's a lot of vested interests that tend to be heard first. And you see this all across the country. And I think this is why collective action matters, and it's why we've set up SLAM. And land has to be highlighted as the key issue, like not just in rural areas, but like Mary was saying, if you're talking about housing shortages, or urban blight, or fuel poverty, or food security, you know, this is the fundamental issue at the heart of a lot of these things. And the legislation proposed by the Scottish Government has sparked this big debate, and so far the loudest voices have been organisations such as Scottish Land and Estates, who represent landowners in Scotland. Newspapers, especially in rural areas, have gleefully churned out warnings from these organisations about the total devastation facing rural communities if changes to land use and ownership are implemented. And on a national level, the tone is pretty hysterical as well. You get the Telegraph and the Spectator both making comparisons between the Scottish Government's land reform agenda and Robert Mugabe's brutal regime in Zimbabwe. This is their journalism, you know? People read this. There's one specific area of reform that has caused the most overreaction, I think, and this is proposed changes to succession law, inheritance law. And this is maybe the one that sounds the most boring, but it's also the one that's one of the most crucial aspects. Survival of the distinction between heritable and movable assets in Scots law is one of the anomalies that's made the legal structure so advantageous to those with considerable tracts of land. It's been a very long running, you know, hundreds of years. And this much needed modernisation has been opposed time and time again over the past century by those whose interests and wealth it protects, so nothing's really changed. And similarly, the proposed restoration of business taxes on sporting estates is causing outrage, and warnings of job losses and bankruptcy are filling the pages of the Scotsman and the Courier. They're quite hard to miss. It's actually pretty hard to find out, as Andy's done a lot of research on, how many of the great sporting estates that take up 50% of the privately owned land in the Highlands do actually run at a profit. It's perhaps instead their prestige and their status that are valued kind of like a yacht. But that's a debatable thing, because again the information's quite hard to find. The justification's often heard that such large estates provide rural jobs and stewardship, but recently environmental experts and campaigners have been again issuing warnings that the frantic drive to boost numbers of red grouse and deer has a really significant environmental cost. So from our point of view, there's nothing that glorious about the glorious 12th. But as happens so often, these arguments, sensible arguments for modernisation and reform, get drowned out by these sort of dire warnings of job losses and financial gloom, and everyone's supposed to sit back down and say, oh well, never mind. And that isn't fostering a democratic debate. It's more like blackmail, you know. The Scottish Environment Minister launched the Land Reform Agenda last year by saying that no one would design such a system of stark inequality. It's ludicrous that such a system still exists. Because if the estates aren't profitable, why would they remain the dominant form of land use? This is just one of many, many questions. It can't be the main focus, but the many questions we should be asking, such as why are tenant farmers in Scotland suffering the worst conditions in Europe, so the most insecure conditions? They're in a very, very difficult position. And these are lots of questions we should be asking. But I think a really important point that we want to make is that this push for land reform is not about pursuing vendettas against individuals. And that has been how it's been framed in the newspapers especially. But it's about bringing our country into the 21st century and creating a structure of land use and ownership under which people can flourish and fragile ecosystems can thrive. Just because the current situation has managed to persist for so long doesn't make it natural or normal. As a campaigner I know called Aileen Mackay, who's writing about her involvement in the referendum, and she said that all these different movements coming together to democratise Scotland, whether it's economy or political structure or land, they're not extreme demands, they're just very, very long overdue.
We want to see the passion and the drive from the referendum campaign, which I know all of you will have been involved in, especially as this is partly run by Women for Indy. It was fantastic, and what we want to see now is that focused into an effort in bringing about radical land reform in Scotland. So we know people are angry about this, we know people want to fight. The spirit of this is not something. Okay?
Aren't we?
the spirit of independence
It's wet.
has not gone away. So we want to see people setting up local groups and meetings, and SLAM will be setting up a group setup pack that local groups can get hold of and use that to facilitate their meetings. Campaign and protest and wanted developments like the film studios. It's not too late for that. Write to your MSP and tell them how they should vote in the new land reform bill that is currently going through Parliament. So just let those who have held the balance of power for so long know that the land is ours. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Charlotte and Jen. 7:30, so I'll just say a few words for 15-20 minutes or so. My name's Andy Wightman. I've been working on land issues for longer than I care to remember, really. It was when I was at university I studied forestry at Aberdeen University, and when I was there, there was a big fuss over tree planting in the so-called flow country of Caithness and Sutherland. These were very deep peatlands in the far north. And people like Terry Wogan and Hurricane Higgins and Shirley Porter, wealthy people in London, were using tax breaks to plant trees in Caithness. And one day the chief executive of the company that was promoting this came to give us a lecture. And afterwards I asked a naive question. I said, why is the government giving millions of pounds in tax breaks to rich people in London to buy land 500 miles away in Caithness to plant trees? Why doesn't it just give that same amount of money that it's foregoing in tax revenues to the farmers and the crofters and the landowners in Caithness, and they could plant the trees? Like, I just didn't understand. If you wanted to plant trees, like, why would you do it this way? And I don't really remember the answer, but I do remember afterwards my professor took me aside and said he didn't think it was a very clever idea to ask such politically controversial questions. And I didn't know what was politically controversial about it, but I soon realised when I got pointed to various books, like Tom Johnson's History of the Working Classes in Scotland, etc., that when you raise questions about land and money and power, people get uncomfortable. And I really enjoyed making people uncomfortable, so I've sort of continued to ask those questions, and they're vital questions. So as Mary said, some important observations there, and as Charlotte highlighted as well, this is just the start of a process of engaging and discussing and debating what we do about Scotland's land, because it's an issue that's been rumbling on for a long, long time. It's a very, very inadequate attention, and it won't be dealt with by one bill in one parliament. I was in the 90s when I wrote a book called Who Owns Scotland, which was an attempt to find out who owns Scotland. And I concluded that book, I published it in 1996, and I concluded by saying that we needed a Scottish Parliament to begin to debate and resolve these matters. And there were two principal reasons, in my view, why that was necessary. I mean, I had other reasons why I supported the Scottish Parliament, but first of all was that the Secretary of State for Scotland, who got about 3 legislative slots per year in Westminster to put through Scottish legislation, and things like the abolition of feudal tenure, which, you know, France did 300 years ago, sort of thing, never had, you know, never enough of a priority to fill those 3 legislative slots that the Secretary of State for Scotland got each year. And the other thing, of course, was the House of Lords. Any legislation had to go through the House of Lords. And it was stuffed full of hereditary peers and landowners. The landed class, of course, had been very successful during the 80s and 90s because their members were in government. People like Mansfield at Scone Estates, he was a minister. Other people I can't even remember. All these old men who owned land in Scotland, many of whom were not even elected. But they were all ministers of state. Lord Lindsay, he's still around, I think. You know, ministers of state in the Scottish office, not even elected. And I was, you know, outraged by this, and many other people were. But at the time, when you went to conferences about land issues, whether to do with housing or whatever, you could only really talk about these fundamental questions about who owned the land afterwards, when you had a drink together, because these were not questions that you raised in polite company. Parliament changed all that. And I hope it continues to do so. The other thing that Mary said was very important is that this is an issue about urban, rural and marine Scotland. In the past, and certainly early on in the Parliament, there was a sense in which this was just to do with the Highlands. And I remember going to a meeting with Alan Wilson, who was the junior minister in charge of land reform in 2003, and I wanted to get this community right to buy legislation extended right across the whole of Scotland. Now, we couldn't do it across the whole of Scotland for some technical reason, but I wanted to expand the definition of rural. And rural at that time was just defined as anything out with settlements of more than 3,000 people. So places like Dalkeith would not be rural. It's got a population of, I don't know, what, 9,000? What's the population of Dalkeith? No idea, right, okay, well probably, let's say 8,000, right? So Dalkeith wouldn't be eligible, Preston Pans wouldn't be eligible.
13 we're getting here.
Oh, 13, oh that's quite very close, right, okay. Well anyway, take Preston Pans, or I don't know, Midlothian or somewhere. Wouldn't be. And so I said to Alan, so I had a meeting with him, and we're at the top of the Scotch Malt Whisky Society at the top of the High Street. And he turned up with a tray of, a flask of coffee and some biscuits. And it didn't have a civil servant with him. And this is unusual if you meet ministers, they always have a civil servant with them. I said, why have you not got any civil servants with you? And he said, well, because they don't agree with this idea of extending the... I said, well, that's great, you know, you're the bloody minister, right? So anyway, we sort of knocked around this problem, and then we realised that this was February 2003, and May 2003 is an election. So I said, I'll write you a line for the Labour Party manifesto. So I wrote a line in the Labour Party manifesto saying we will extend the opportunities afforded by land reform to people or whatever. And that meant that they could then extend it to these 3,000 to 10,000, which brought in about 120 settlements in Scotland. This was important. And then Jack McConnell, to launch this idea that we're going to extend. Where did he go to launch this? Did he go to Wishaw? Did he go to Shotts in his own constituency? No, he went to Assynt in Sutherland, reinforcing the idea that this is just about a few scruffy crofters in the Highlands. I'm sorry, but there was only 3 places in the Highlands that were brought in by this legislation: Dingwall, Fort William, and somewhere else, Stornoway, I think. So anyway, we've had to struggle to drag this issue from being one of a few communities at the margins, highlighted by campaigns around the Isle of Egg and things like that, to being to being an issue that affects everyone in Scotland. So this is a very broad issue. It includes issues to do with the private rented sector and land tenure and housing, and how we frame the rights and responsibilities associated with rented housing. It includes, as I say, the marine environment. Over half of Scotland is underwater, so the legal territory of Scotland extends out to 12 miles, the territorial waters of Scotland. And 52% of Scotland, therefore, is underwater. And this is an important resource. And of course, we've got a whole debate around the devolution of the Crown Estate Commissioners to Scotland under the Smith Commission proposals. That brings huge opportunities, etc. So this is a very, very big topic. And it's also not just about bits of physical land, it's actually quite big economically. For example, when Gordon Brown became Chancellor in 1997, in his first budget, he said he would not allow house prices to get out of control. He also said no return to boom and bust and things. But 10 years later, house prices have trebled. And house prices today in the UK are still very, very high. And they're a huge drag, particularly for young people having to take on our large amounts of debt. George Osborne, our dear Chancellor, was in Dublin in 2006, giving a lecture at Trinity College, Dublin. And he said that Ireland, well, he gave a long speech, it included in which he said Ireland stands as a shining example of the art of the possible and long-term economic policy making. 2 years later, Ireland crashed and burned. And the reason Ireland crashed and burned was well put by a writer in the Financial Times at the time, who said at the height of the lunacy, around 3/4 of the total lending by Irish banks, 420 billion euros, or about 2.5 times the size of the economy, got bound up in property construction and land speculation of one sort or another, a sort of Northern Rock on steroids. And that had come out of the United States, where we'd seen subprime mortgages, money being lent to poor people, who said, well, you know, you're giving us these teaser rates of interest of 0%, so that we can take out loans to buy houses. What happens in 2 years when these 0% ends? And the banks and the financial institutions told these people, don't worry, you buy a house, you borrow $200,000 today, it'll be worth $250,000 in 2 years. If you can't afford the repayments, just sell and you'll be even better off. So this huge Ponzi scheme, and these mortgages were then packaged up in financial products, derivatives, to securitise and sold around the world, and we all know what happened when people couldn't pay. So land is kind of central, in fact, to the economic crisis. And I've been working on land issues right across Scotland, from areas of land that are old bits of common land that local landowners have nabbed, to issues to do with common good land, common land in the towns and cities, to folk in places like Linwood, in Renfrewshire, who back in 2000, 2002, Linwood obviously was a place that expanded in the 1960s with the new car factory in Linwood, but then went into a state of decline. The shopping centre in the middle of Linwood was held on a long lease, 160-year lease, by a company called Balmore Properties Limited. They started to jack up the rents for the shops, and the shopkeepers all slowly went out of business. They couldn't afford the rents. And the town centre became a derelict area. Linwood won the Pluke on the Plinth award, the most dismal place in Scotland. And then Tesco came in and said, we'll take over the town centre, we'll redevelop it, and people thought, well, that's quite a good idea. Wendy Alexander was the MSP at the time, and the folk in Linwood focused their ire on this company called Balmore Properties Limited. And Wendy Alexander said, from 2001, Balmore's stewardship was simply a disgrace following on from years of neglect. They repeatedly refused to meet the community or elected representatives. And then, of course, when Tesco stepped in, they began discovering some dark secrets. Wendy Alexander again said, in 2005 and 6, when I and many in the community were actively involved looking for a major retailer to step in, the Tesco representatives gave no indication to the community of any long-standing relationship with Balmore. They should have done so. And the reason they should have done so was Balmore was a very small company based in Glasgow that was acting as a front company under instructions from Tesco to take over land, drive out the tenants, and allow Tesco then to come in. And as the local councillor at the time said, Tesco came in like a knight in shining armour and said they were going to fix it. It was all a con. And Tesco, when they were challenged on their duplicity, said it is common for Tesco to use an agent and secure land. Balmore Properties was an agent for Tesco at the time. So in other words, at the heart of that dilemma was folk in a place like Linwood who didn't know anything about who this company was, who they were operating on behalf of, or even in fact much about the nature of the lease they had. So land matters everywhere, because what's happening in your community is down to a whole series of decisions made by very, very many people, but ultimately it comes down to decisions about places, how they're used, and places, all places in Scotland ultimately are owned by somebody. Now in my book, and I've written a fantastic book called The Poor Had No Lawyers, which I thoroughly recommend. I wrote this in 2010 because I was aware that the land reform agenda had sort of died, and I tell the story of what actually happened in 2007 when the government changed. But I knew it would come back again. It had to come back again because it was too important. So I thought, well, I want to write a book to help inform people so that when it comes back next time, we're all going to be just a little bit better informed. And I'm absolutely delighted at the extent to which the issue's been picked up. Organisations like kind of SLAM have emerged. I was in Kirriemuir last night. We had over 200 people turn out in a very, very windy, wet night in Kirriemuir to talk about land reform. This is like bizarre. 5 years ago, you'd have got about 10 people. And we certainly would not have been meeting in the town hall. So things are really rocking and rolling. What I want to finish by saying, yeah, I mean, land matters for some really important personal reasons to everybody. We all need a place to call home. And I said one of the critical issues facing the UK and Scotland, facing young people in particular, is the cost of housing. The government, Scottish Government commissioned a land reform review group set up, and they produced this report, The Land of Scotland and the Common Good, back in May 2012, and you can download this or you can contact the Scottish Government and ask them for hard copies. They still have many hard copies, and they'll send you a hard copy. And in this report they cover everything from inheritance law, compulsory purchase, national forest estate, community buyouts, urban renewal, land taxation, tenant farms, water, deer, all sorts of stuff relating to the way in which land in Scotland is owned and used. But one of the chapters they have is on housing, and it shows how back in 1930 a building worker in the UK could buy a house for 3.5 times their annual earnings. That was affordable. Now, for a building worker and building workers' wages, would have to earn 7.5 times. A house would cost 7.5 times their annual earnings. And not only that, but in 1930, the building worker, or indeed anybody who was buying a house, only spent about 2 to 5% of the cost of the house was the cost of the land. So 90% of the money they had available through their own resources and savings, and also through a loan, could be spent employing people to build houses and acquiring materials to do so. Nowadays, the kind of average land value component of a modern house is anything from 40 to 60, even 70% of the price of a new house. And that means that people are taking on large levels of debt simply to feed banks. And on the continent of Europe, in countries like Belgium and Germany and places like that, if you want to build a new house, you can go into the local municipality, you can buy a plot of land for about 20,000 euros. And then in countries like Germany, you employ any but one of thousands, tens of thousands of small companies who will build you very high quality houses that will last for 150 to 200 years design life, will be very, very cheap to run. So in other words, these countries are making much, much better use of their land because they're making sure that it's much cheaper, and they're making sure that the amount of money that people borrow in the financial markets is then, the financial impact of that is maximised by actually employing people to build high quality housing. So land's critical to all that. It's also critical to the whole kind of financing and taxation system in Britain. There's a famous story about the Jubilee Line extension in London that was built from the end of the Jubilee Line, wherever that was, but they extended it out to Canary Wharf in the East End. This was during the 1980s, and this was the redevelopment of the East End of London and the new financial district. And there was 8 new stations built along this route, and a nice modern underground railway station. And there was a property developer called Don Riley, who was an Australian property developer who owned a lot of land at the East End. He bought it in the late 70s, anticipating that this railway would be built and the East End would begin to be regenerated as the docks were closing, etc. And he was very happy that we built this railway station, this new railway line. And he actually did a survey within 500 metres of all the new stations along the line, and calculated that land values within 500 metres of the new stations had risen by £13.5 billion. London School of Economics did a survey and reckoned it was 9.75 billion. But we're talking about 10, 11, perhaps 12 billion pounds rise in land values due to the fact that we, the public, had built a railway, and it cost us £3.5 billion of taxpayers' money to build a railway that resulted in land value uplift of 2 or 3 times that amount. And the fact is that in Britain today, a lot of the economy is based on land speculation. A lot of the inequality in society is down to the inequalities in wealth. If you look at the national statistics surveys on wealth, it's not only straightforward property that's disproportionately owned by the top 10% decile, but they're also much, much more wealthy because of pensions. A lot of pension funds are invested in land. You speak to, as I was a few weeks ago, one of the trustees of the Strathclyde Pension Fund, who just bought and sold some shopping centres in Norfolk. I said, why are you buying and selling shopping centres in Norfolk? Why don't you buy land in Strathclyde, build houses on it for affordable rent for your members and for the wider community in Strathclyde, which would earn you a good 1.7, 2.1% return for years and years and years and years. And of course the point was it was much, much more profitable to buy and sell shopping centres than it was to invest in the long-term future of people living in places like Strathclyde. And how we tax land as well was brought home to me by a big fire that took place in Glasgow about 2 or 3 years ago, I think 2013, at Morrison Street at the south end of Kingston Bridge. Some of you may remember it. It was an old co-op warehouse. It went on fire. It was the biggest fire in Glasgow for many, many years. I'm a kind of sad person when these things happen. I want to know who owns it. And I found out it was owned by a company called Strabane Developments Limited. They bought it in 2003. This was 2013. Because it's an empty industrial building, in our great wisdom, we have chosen to apply 0% non-domestic rates on empty industrial property. So it's in the valuation roll at about £500,000, this property. But we've chosen in our infinite wisdom to say you don't need to pay any rates on those kinds of buildings. So they would normally be paying about £250,000 a year in non-domestic rates, in other words in property taxes, to Glasgow City Council. So over the 10 years they occupied the building, well they didn't actually occupy it, they owned it. That was £2.5 million that hadn't been given over to Glasgow City Council, and yet when the building went on fire they still expected Strathclyde Fire and Rescue to come and put out the fire, which they did with 20 fire appliances at great cost and expense over a whole week. They still expected the police to come out and maintain public order. The streets were closed for at least a month. They expected the courts and all the apparatus of the civil state to be there to serve them and provide them with a forum in which they could, at law perhaps, have to settle issues to do with liability and insurance, etc. And what they ended up with was a site razed to the ground, a bare site that is now worth more than the site was with the building on it, because it was a liability, but they've paid no tax. And these are the kind of relationships and stories we need to start understanding in order to get a proper relationship between land and people. And the other wee story on that was kind of highlighted to me, which is really kind of mad, was last year I was doing a study with a Dublin economist looking at land value tax in Northern Ireland. If you want to know about land value tax, read this report on my website. It's probably the most thorough report we've done on the topic, because we were paid a decent amount of money to do it, which was nice. But as part of that, I was looking at other countries in Europe and how they do property tax and stuff. And Denmark was an obvious place to look at, because it's quite interesting for various reasons. And at the time, I just tripped over this campaign that was being run by the by SCAT, who are the Danish tax authorities. And they at that time were running a campaign to get Danish citizens to declare to the tax authorities property that they owned outside Denmark. Because Denmark has property taxes, and one of these taxes is a land tax, which is also payable not only on property you own in Denmark, but is also payable on any property you own outside Denmark. Now, a lot of Danes own kind of holiday houses on the South Norwegian coast. That was fairly straightforward, because the Nordic Council shares a lot of data to do with members, citizens with member states of the Nordic Council. But of course, nobody really knew how many villas in the south of France were owned by Danish citizens or whatever. So I phoned up SCAT, emailed them, and said, how many properties in the United Kingdom do you have owned by Danish citizens who are paying this Danish land tax? And they said 58. And I said, you know what? You're probably talking about 580 or even 5,800 Danes own property in London alone. I think you're way underrepresenting this. And there's about 395,000 acres of land in Scotland owned by Danish citizens. I said, do you want to go in some kind of deal here? I could help you identify them, and I could take a cut, of the yield, and then they start getting suspicious in communications. But the point is that there are people like Anders Paulsen, who's a Danish billionaire, who's buying up land in Scotland. He now owns 190,000 acres of land in Scotland. I'm sure he's paying his taxes. So on his estates in Scotland, he's paying taxes on the land to his home municipality in Esbjerg to build beautiful kindergartens for Danish children, but paying no tax to Highland Council and Aberdeenshire Council and Perth and Kinross. And this is kind of bizarre. And this is all about better understanding land, fiscal relations, land tenure. We've all got to get a kind of skill up and be more literate in our debates on all of these kinds of topics. So I'll probably stop there, but I just want to conclude perhaps by saying that this is also about democracy. And a lot of people are now very interested not only in getting more powers in Scotland, whether independence or fiscal autonomy or whatever, but also having much more power at a local level. We've really eroded local government in Scotland. It's now responsible for a tiny fraction of the money it used to raise. It used to raise 80% of its own finance. In the 19th century, when people in Edinburgh and Glasgow elected MPs, they would gather at Waverley Station or Central Station. There'd be bunting up, there'd be flags, there'd be pipe bands playing, the provost would come and give a speech, and they would wave bye-bye to these MPs who were going to London to sue for peace in the Sudan and repeal the Corn Laws and whatever else they did in London, and they didn't expect to see these people back here again, because 99% of what happened in a city like Edinburgh or indeed Dalkeith was done by the town council or the corporation. We had a good split of powers in those days. Now it's much more fuzzy. You've got national politicians going around saying, inviting you to their surgery on a Monday for you to come in and complain about graffiti in the bus stop, all in that process of trying to get your vote. And the kind of democratic separation of powers between the kind of local and national has begun to erode. And in European countries, if you go to France, you go to the local mayor's office, you can find out who owns the land. My sister lives in Switzerland. You go into the local municipality office there, and they've got a map of who owns all the land. None of this is secret. It's open knowledge that everyone has paid their land tax. In places like Florida, for example, if you don't pay your property tax for 10 years, you can go into the local tax collection office and you can pay the outstanding bill and you get given the property. Places like Germany and Denmark and Norway, their local municipalities raise half the income taxes paid directly to the local commune. So in a place like Dalkeith last month, when I paid my income tax, it went to George Osborne. I'm self-employed, so I had a direct check to George Osborne. I didn't actually own a secure site in the HMRC website, so I did an electronic transfer. And it went to George Osborne, and then, Scottish Parliament gets a block of money, and then John Swinney has a big kind of wrestling match with Cosla, and eventually Midlothian Council sees a bit, but Dalkeith, doesn't get anything really meaningful. But in the past, in certain places like Norway, for example, 28% income tax, half of that goes straight to your local municipality. So in a meeting like here tonight, I would expect to see, if I was in Hemsedal commune in Norway, or a municipality in Denmark, I'd expect to see 1 or 2 councillors from this town, to whom last week I paid a substantial amount of money, half my income tax. And you meet these people in the playground, and in the shops, and the football match in the pub, and you stare them in the eye, and they have to account to you for how they're spending your money. And that matters. And they also make really important decisions locally about land use, etc. So just finally, the Scottish Government, as Charlotte and Ben and Charlotte, two work on men, has launched a consultation which should close now on what should be in a land reform bill. And it includes stuff to do with land information systems, charity law, Scottish Land Reform Commission, barring titles in offshore tax havens, reforming the law around agricultural tenancies, and so on. And this will be introduced into the Scottish Parliament in May or June, probably this year, and there'll be a whole other new set of opportunities for people to engage in the debate. But it's not just a land reform bill, they're also talking about other reforms, other legislative bits in their programme which are also, in my view, land reform, such as reform of the council tax. I was spending all this morning, I'm a member of the Commission on Local Tax Reform, which has been set up as a cross-party initiative, except the Tories haven't joined, to try and work up what we're going to do about the council tax, because all political parties are unhappy with it and have all had their fingers burnt. So that's important, because that is about taxation of land, about land that's occupied for domestic purposes, domestic taxation. They're proposing, as Charlotte was saying, a law on inheritance, which gives equal rights to children to inherit land, as they currently do legal rights to inherit books and cars and jewellery and money. And that's a particularly important issue for women who historically have been disenfranchised when it comes to land. They're talking about a bill to reform the law relating to trust ports. That's ports and harbours around the country that were set up in the 19th century. Social enterprises, one of the oldest forms of social enterprise in the country, modernising the law there. The Law Commission has launched a consultation on reforming the law of compulsory purchase, which is important. The government's announced a 10-year target to complete the land register. And finally, as I mentioned at the beginning, the Smith Commission proposals to repatriate the administration and revenues of the Crown Estate. So there's heaps of stuff going on. It's all terribly, terribly important in my view. And the important thing for people is to begin to engage with this debate at a level that they kind of feel comfortable at. So one other thing, there's the Community Empowerment Bill going through Parliament, and that's got stuff on allotments, on community planning, on common good, on bringing the community right to buy legislation into urban areas. So there's a fantastic amount going on, and there's really no excuse now for people in the age of kind of social media and easier access to information and a more political enthusiasm around in the country. Very little excuse really for not getting engaged at some level in this debate. So I'll stop there. Thank you.
In the audience who would like to ask Andy, Jen or Charlotte some questions. So would you just put your hand up and indicate? Yes, sir.
Andy, I'm very confused. The only thing I agree with you about is that land matters. But in your speech you've ridiculed the land ownership system, you've ridiculed the planning system, you've ridiculed the political system. You've looked at history and apparently learned very little from it. And you're groaning about something that you say is the land reform agenda, but we don't know what it is. You have found nothing positive in existing conditions. You fail to recognise that we have consultative proceedings and processes in central government and in local government which work on the whole. They're not perfect, and of course they can all be improved. You have attacked the rating system, the taxation system, the inheritance system, and no doubt the legal system, which is where I belong. But I have many, many clients from all levels of the population. You've attacked rising land values, and you've appeared to denigrate the idea that people's efforts might result in some reward greater than, for example, his neighbour. or his neighbour but one, or his neighbour but two. So my question is, because that is the polite thing to do, is ask a question. What's the land reform agenda about? Is it about a dissatisfaction with the whole of politics and the whole of the civic society in which we live? Is it about inequality of ownership, in that some own more than others? Or is it about the headline in your speech, which is what I suggest it should be about, which is how land is used and adapted to its most profitable outcome for the purposes of our society, our Scottish society? What's the agenda?
Thank you very much, sir. I'm sure Andy's quite
Thank you very much.
Three questions
It's
there.
not where we are when we speak, because I don't know who this gentleman is and where it comes from. So when we talk, can we just say your name?
Could you say your name, sir, and where you're from?
I'm John Campbell, and I'm an advocate.
Thank you very much, John. I don't recognise your portrayal of what I was saying. I'm not, denigrating all these things. I'm saying that these are important topics to engage with that have been neglected, in my view, in many ways for too long, where laws and policies have been developed in the past that have very little rational basis. For example, the derating of agricultural land. Why does the florist and the butcher and the candlestick maker pay local property taxes, but the farm on the outskirts of town doesn't? I don't understand that. Maybe there's a good reason. If there is, let's hear it. So I'm just raising what I regard as important questions about our relationship as a society and as a community, as communities, with land. And so when you ask what is land reform about, the Land Reform Review Group, whose report I'm sure you've read, defined land reform, and I quote, as measures that modify or change the arrangements governing the possession and use of land in Scotland in the public interest. And I would simply suggest to you that that is what land reform is about. It's not about, there's a political dimension to it, there's a fiscal, there's an economic dimension to it, there's a cultural dimension to it. One of the first people I met when I was a student in Aberdeen University was an old lady called Jean Bain. Jean was a lovely lady. She was a tenant farmer in Deeside. She died very sadly in 1992. She was the last native speaker of Deeside Gaelic. Deeside Gaelic was a really interesting language. Nobody crossed the Cairngorms much in the past. It evolved, very distinct from the rest of Scottish Gaelic, and it was also infused with a lot of Doric and Aberdonian. A fantastic language. She was the last native speaker. She died in 92 and the language died. And the reason there are not more native speakers of Deeside Gaelic is everything to do with the fact in 1886, when they passed the Crofting Tenure Act, which gave security of tenure to small farmers, they excluded Aberdeenshire from its scope. Now that was a political act done by the lowland landed classes to make sure that the peasants of lowland Scotland would not benefit from these reforms, but it's had an ongoing impact on the pattern of occupation and culture in Scotland. So my view is these things matter. Now other people may take different views as to what matters or what to do about it, and that's fine. I'm totally relaxed about that. I have my views, but I think the most important thing about this is that people understand the importance of this debate and engage with it, because at the end of the day, to answer your question directly, this is about democratising arrangements governing the possession and use of land in Scotland, making it more accountable, making it more transparent, extending opportunity to many, many more people, and fundamentally about issues to do with equality.
Thanks, Andy. Anybody else?
Hi, my name's Glenn Dixon, and I was just wondering what that document from the Scottish Government was called.
You were wondering what the document from the Scottish Government was called.
Yeah.
Okay, there's two documents. One is not really from the Scottish Government, it was from a review group established by the Scottish Government called the Land Reform Review Group. It's called The Land of Scotland and the Common Good. So it's a 260-page report, as I said, covering everything from wild deer to access to housing to minerals, common good funds. And then in November last year, the Scottish Government published this consultation on land reform, which closed on the 10th of February. So the Scottish Government is currently involved in a process of working up a draft bill for introduction to Parliament sometime later. come up.
A lot of the organisations who submitted responses to that consultation document have published their responses online. So if you go to, like, Rick, and I think yours is online as well, is it?
Yes, yes, if you go to my website, I've got a page called Hot Topics, Land Reform, and you'll get documents there actually. And, other
You can
resources.
find ours as well on our
Yes,
website.
of course, it's a great website too.
Yes, sir.
My name's Ian Baxter, I'm a councillor on the Midlothian Council, I'm a Green Party councillor. I'd like to take issue with something that John just mentioned when he said that we have a system of consultation and the democratic processes that work. Well, I would say they don't work, and I see that from the inside. I took part in a debate just a couple of months ago on the Midlothian Local Development Plan. That was taken in private. I challenged it. I was the only councillor to challenge it, and I was overruled because there was supposed to be some sort of commercial confidentiality involved, which to this day I still don't know what that was about. I challenged the local plan on a number of counts, principally because it refers to sustainable growth and sustainability, and yet we don't have a biodiversity officer, and haven't had one for years, to even look at the plan. We don't have an officer who is at the moment responsible for looking at the implications as regards to climate change. Now these are fundamental if you're looking at something, a plan for building and for development and for economic growth over the next few years. I refer to the fact that the biggest objection I had as regards the detail of the plan was a proposal to build a big new road at Strayton and to double the size of Strayton Retail Park. I said, given that we don't have anybody looking at the sustainability of this, how can we put forward a proposal which will allow people to travel quickly from Pennycoop or from Edinburgh to Strayton, but doesn't cater for the fact that the increased traffic that would attract will clog up the roads across Midlothian. And there's no public transport. In fact, the only public transport that goes from here, for example, to Strayton is going to be removed within the next few weeks. It won't even go through Strayton. So there was no way that that plan addressed modal shift. It didn't even refer to modal shift. It was just an excuse to build more roads, to build more, a bigger retail park. I refer to the fact that that consultation had, I think it was 4 representations in favour of developing the road. 2 of those were from developers, and I think 1 from the RSPB who says as long as you build a few hedges we're happy with it. There were over 100 that were opposed to it, and yet I was told that the reasons given in those objections were not material. So, you know, this is consultation and this is democracy in action. I'm sorry, but I don't agree with John.
Do you have an actual question, Ian?
Sorry. What are your views on that?
Well, I would probably agree with that. It's interesting. Sorry. Interesting today, we were looking a bit through the Midlothian local plan and specifically at this development of the film studios, and we came across it, and I do some work for the Woodland Trust specifically looking at local plans, local development plans, and I was struck by the fact that it seemed to have very, very few comments, and for such a big development I was very surprised at that. Usually you get a lot, and I found one letter from a gentleman who tried to go to this consultation in an Asda, and he said it was so confusing, he could barely find it, and he's spoken to a lot of people who had the same problem. So I definitely feel that a lot of the planning process is quite dense and hidden and difficult to wade through, and this does not provide a democratic output for the people who live in the area. So I would agree with you that the planning process does need to be streamlined in quite a way.
I think from my point of view, what's happened in a lot of the councils, the government, Scottish Government, and any bureaucratic organisation has set up structures that suit them. And always when a normal punter person in the community wants to do something, they are hit with, oh, well, you have to do it this way, or you have to do it that way, or you have to find out about Section 3, Clause number 2, and submit this 2 years ago. Now that is my experience, and my experience is very limited. I haven't got a great experience in this, but I do know that the structures should be working for the people, not for the organisations.
I'd just like to draw a couple of points just based on the limited discussion we've already had. The first thing is that John Campbell gives very eloquent understanding of quite a few issues, and I'd like to just summarise.
Can't hear you, Susan, sorry.
I'd like to just summarise what you said, John, if I can.
What's your name, please?
My name's Susan Goldbar, I'm a local resident. What John said by summing up by saying, you were more or less saying, don't throw the baby out with the bathwater, because there's this infrastructure. Is that fair? It's a very difficult issue, there's lots of things to understand about it. The structure is there, it's not perfect. And then Ian Baxter went on to make a very specific point about the planning system, which is, I know a bit about that through personal bitter experience. And I go back to Andy, and I make the point that Andy made, we need to upskill. Every one of us needs to upskill, because every issue you'll come to talk about will be an issue in its own right. So don't generalise. Don't say, well, because this has happened in Lone Head, this is terrible in Dublin. Upskill. And then get yourselves into a local democratic group and look at it issue by issue, as you did, Andy, with Portobello Park. Look how complicated Portobello Park became over those who wanted a school and those who wanted to keep a park. It wasn't straightforward. It's not black and white. The law is there and it works. Do not throw the baby out with the bathwater. John's right. The planning system is poor and it's not good in many, many places. But look at it issue by issue.
Thanks very much.
Thank you.
I had a couple of questions. I'm
Sorry.
Jennifer, I'm with Midlothian Matters. It's sort of around issues that probably a lot of people feel quite strongly about that go beyond the borders of Scotland. But I was wondering about things like, so your Hal Myers example with the RDS, and the fact that maybe that community will triumph after going through the courts. And things like TTIP, to what extent that's going to make that, things even harder, and it's coming, I think, whether we like it or not, what that's going to mean for our debate about our little country when you're looking at it in the global sort of perspective. And then thinking about fracking as well. So one of the things I was wondering about was if you've got a landowner who's maybe got a very large area of land in which there is a potential real, coal area, and because of the way that potentially you can start here and end up over there, do those landowners benefit from, are they the ones who are ultimately going to pocket the money, or does it ultimately end up in the coffers of Westminster? But I really don't know where that money flows.
I can talk a wee bit about TTIP because that's what I campaign on at the moment in my other job. TTIP, it was a sort of foregone conclusion that this would happen, and now I think extraordinarily it's not. I'd give you a bit of hope here because the movement against it is so large and people have become so well informed that the issues like ISDS, the investor-state dispute system, have been pushed to such a level in the European Parliament they've now been sort of temporarily shelved. So I'll not go into it, but that, I wouldn't say that's a foregone conclusion, so keep campaigning because we might just win that one, and that would be good because, as you say, it's extremely dangerous. If we want to push to get our government to protect us, to enforce environmental protections with fracking, for anything like that, food and safety, all of our efforts are in vain if we have trade deals that remove these rights. So you're quite right, that's a really sort of shadowing over issue. In terms of fracking, we do have the moratorium in Scotland now for a year, maybe 2 years, which is great, but it's certainly not off the agenda. And I know that the Duke of Buccleuch was involved in down south, I think, of the country, was involved in a dispute and was one of the people who certainly did stand to benefit a great deal, and the coffers of Westminster as well. And as with sort of DART and iGas and other, INEOS are now the big ones pushing it, they give a sort of community bribe or benefit, depending on how you want to see that. So yeah, this is another issue that you're right, it just comes down to land ownership and land use, and how the wishes of the community there can be ridden over very quickly because they have very, very little influence in determining what happens to that land use. So, yeah. Did that answer it?
I mean, just briefly on the fracking. Of course, the Smith Commission is proposing to devolve powers over licensing of onshore hydrocarbons. We'll see if that happens. Legally speaking, of course, the situation in the United Kingdom is that hydrocarbons are nationalised. So oil and gas deposits belong to the Crown, belong to the state, and have been, well, since the 1974 Petroleum Act. That's unlike, for example, the United States of America, where if you own a bit of land in Texas, you also own the hydrocarbons underneath. If you own a piece of land here, you own to the centre of the earth and the heavens above, but certain things are reserved, so hydrocarbons, for example. And that means in the United States there's much more of an incentive for landowners to get into fracking, because they actually own the mineral, actually own the hydrocarbons, and they can sell it. That's not the case in the UK, so what landowners stand to benefit from fracking is basically permission and rents to install equipment necessary to drill. And of course they could also negotiate a share of profits, etc. So it's still quite remunerative. As for the controversial question of drilling horizontally underneath other people's land, that remains to be resolved. The principle is not controversial. In the 1920s, when we started civil aviation, in theory, if you wanted to fly a civil aviation plane from London to Edinburgh, you needed to get permission of every landowner over whose land you were flying, because they owned the land. Obviously that was ridiculous, so they passed the Civil Aviation Act, which allowed essentially nationalised airspace and allowed people to cross it unhindered. So applying that principle underground, which is what's being proposed, would be just the flip side of that. As to whether it's a good idea or not, that debate can be had. But at the moment, they do need primary legislation to allow people to drill underneath your property without your consent. But it's most likely that legislation will be passed. Westminster's passed legislation for England and Wales, and as I understand it, they've omitted Scotland. So Scotland was meant to be in it, but now they've omitted it. So the Scottish Parliament has to pass legislation for that.
Any other questions?
Yes.
My name's Caroline. You spoke about devastation to the shooting estates. I think if they had to pay taxes, is that right? I heard you say something about devastation to the shooting estates. Was it if they were having to pay taxes?
Well, I was saying that's the version of events that's being put forward an awful lot in certain newspapers, certainly, and that I think it's a narrative that should be questioned.
That's right. Well, I would also. Would you not agree that there was devastation caused in the making of some of these shooting estates?
Yes.
Like, for instance, in Liddesdale, there were hundreds of people were lost farms, small holdings, forced starvation, when Buccleuch, by his efforts, gained a lot of land by fire raising, cast down, demolishing. He was ordered by the king to do this. People were hung where people were just killed. There was lack of prisons. People were hung and killed on the spot. There were no prisons to try them. Sorry, but what's the question?
Do you have a question for the panel?
I just feel that we do not agree there's a lot of devastation caused in the making of some of these estates.
Yeah, absolutely. Sorry, maybe you missaid my point. It was.
Yeah, no.
Do you have to apologise for 600 years or 300 years ago history?
Yeah.
No, I think this is where the debate often crops up. How much do we talk about the past? And certainly the past is a pretty dark one when it comes to this history of land ownership in Scotland, in England, in almost anywhere, because it's power grabs, and then they were legalised. And I think it is important to talk about the past. But it's also important to recognise that and learn from that and move on from it as well. So I take both your points, yeah.
Anybody else? Yes, sorry, have you got another? Yes.
Hi, my name is Paula. I was just shocked when you were talking about the warehouse in Glasgow, where it sat empty for years and they weren't paying any council tax on it. Now, I'm selling the flat. We moved house just because, we wanted to move to a different area, but we've been renting out a flat because we couldn't sell it because the market was such a mess for so many years. Now we're trying to sell it and we're paying council tax on an empty flat. There's no way for me to get around that. How on earth do we reform a system so that we can make companies responsible for what they're actually taking from the system?
Okay, good question. I mean, historically in the UK, land was the source of all government revenue. It started off with the king and feudalism and raising feudal dues, and that supported armies and governance. Land taxes then supported the work of the government and flowed to the crown before Parliament really got established, which is why the crown property and crown land and crown revenues are public, because when the king decided to agree to hand them over to Parliament in exchange for the civil list, part of that deal was that the king didn't need to provide standing armies or His Majesty's ships or His Majesty's diplomats or whatever, and the Parliament would do that. So historically, revenues have always flowed from land. 19th century, income taxes were introduced for the first time as temporary taxes. There was huge fuss about it. In the latter part of the 20th century, there's huge debates between Tories and Liberals about land and land taxation, which led to Lloyd George's famous People's Budget. But all the time, although other taxes like sales taxes and fuel taxes and income taxes have grown, land taxes have always been there. And they're still there, except that in the 20th century, they were split into domestic property taxes and non-domestic. So domestic is houses, non-domestic is everything else. And I say the non-domestic's been chipped away, so the landowners got themselves exempted in the 1950s from agriculture. 94 they got exempted from the sporting rates. And at some point in history, someone decided that empty industrial buildings wouldn't have to be rated. That was probably, and I really don't know, I'd have to look at the history, it was probably in the 1980s when we had rapid deindustrialization, and a lot of companies said, well, why should we have to pay rates on, I mean, I don't know, that's probably when it was. But what I was trying to explain was we need to underscore the importance of, A, the principle that all land should pay a certain amount of tax, and B, exploring the rationale for why it may be legitimate to exempt some. But my point would be that, at the very least, all land should be valued, and it should all be in the valuation roll, and that should all be publicly available information and knowledge, so that if Parliament in its wisdom decides that farmers should pay no land tax, if that's what Parliament decides, that's what Parliament decides. But at least we know what the cost of that is to everyone else who has to pay a disproportionate burden. Likewise with empty industrial property. Likewise with 12,500 hectares of land in Scotland that's sitting vacant and derelict. It's paying no property taxes whatsoever. And a lot of these areas, in fact the majority of these areas, are in the poorer neighbourhoods of the west of Scotland, blighting people's lives. So these are all fundamental issues within John Swinney's portfolio. And it's interesting because, when I'll finish on this point, the Scottish Government did a consultation on business, they call it business rates, I don't like that. That, I think, was the supermarkets in the 1990s who got an exemption for not paying rates on their car parks, and they started calling non-domestic rates business rates. And still government talks about business as if it's a tax on business. It's not a tax on business, it's a tax on property, much of which is occupied by businesses. But the Scottish Parliament is one of the biggest ratepayers in the country, pays £5 million a year, bus stops pay rates, etc. But anyway, there's this consultation, and one of the questions said, do you agree with the existing range of exemptions? For example, agriculture, charities get relief, and industrial buildings, etc. And the responses came back. 2/3 of people said no, they don't agree, and for a variety of reasons. The Scottish Government's response was, we have no plans to change any of these. So I think we need some kind of boldness in this, we need some fairness, some greater equity, and it needs to be based on a set of principles, which it currently isn't. And government's very too easily swayed by the Federation of Small Businesses here, and the CBI there, and the Retail Consortium here. And we need to take possession of this debate.
Is there anybody who hasn't spoken who would like to ask another question?
Nicky Turner, Midlothian Matters. So, what do we do? Where do we start? As a kind of Joe Blogs, living in the area, I'm from Pennycook. It's quite dire if you go down Pennycook Street. I think it's 70 to 80% of our area is owned by one landlord, so the rents are unreal for getting in, businesses, small businesses getting in there. So what do we do? Where do we begin? Is it literally getting a group of people together who are talking about skilling up? It seems like a massive area to look. So where do we start as a small kind of group really wanting to get our teeth into this and start looking at it and empowering ourselves to make a change?
Well, I think, as Slam spoke about, setting up local groups is a really good way to make learning and skilling up a little bit more interesting. You can do it as a group, and you can have little slideshows and talk about it and that sort of thing. I think it's also really important what you were saying about business being business not being able to move into the area. In the bill that's going through Parliament, there is a section on landowners being a barrier to sustainable development, and that will be a really important thing for places like that in order to make their appeal if landowners are blighting communities in this way. So learning about the bill and knowing which parts of the bill can empower communities like yourselves is also incredibly important, I think. And yeah, just making it a little bit fun by setting up a local group, and we're trying to be an organisation that will help that, facilitate that, and provide resources and education. I think that is an excellent first step, and reading Andy's book as well is also good. So yeah.
I would say, I've worked with communities right across Scotland on a whole load of issues. So I grew up in Kinross, and about 8 years ago when I was driving through Kinross, for some reason, normally drive up the motorway, but I drove through Kinross, and I passed the town hall, and the town hall was a place where I, as a young lad, used to go to Kinross Folk Festival, see Ali Bain play his fiddle when he was a young lad from Shetland. I went to Cayley's in the street. We won Britain in Bloom 3 times. My mother was head of the local Liberal Party. We were very active in local politics. We ran our own town. Then they abolished the town council, then they abolished the county council. Kinross began to decline, and when I went through it 10 years ago, this town hall was sitting there, empty, with a big sign for sale on it, damp, riddled with dry rot. And I cried. This was the place I grew up in. Next door was the Carnegie Library. It was too closed, the windows were boarded up. I thought, what's happened to this town? I was really shocked. And what was happening at that time was the people in town were fighting Perth and Kinross Council, who were wanting to sell it off, and they were fighting them on the basis that this was common good property, belonged to the people of Kinross. They won the court case. Actually never went to court, they conceded. So from a common good fund of £11, Kinross Common Good Fund rose to, I don't know what the eventual sale price was, somewhere in the region of £390,000. On the back of that experience, folk in Kinross then did a whole mapping exercise, mapping all the publicly owned land in the whole of Kinross. And they came up with an awful lot of very interesting stuff. So one of the things I say to people is just start where you are and start mapping stuff, right? Get a decent map. You can use these old Lloyd George maps of 1910 to find out who owned it. Then my sort of book explains how to do that. You can find out who owns it today from local authority, from the registers, etc. Look at the occupiers, look at the Scottish Assessor's website. That'll tell you the owners and the occupiers, the assessed rateable values, whether they're paying them or not. Have a local exhibition talking about the future of our high street. Have all this information up. My experience is when you put up maps and bits of information that contain bits of information that people didn't know you could get, like who owns that and how much tax do they pay, people get very, very interested. Because it's like lifting a lid on what to you and what to many people is just your high street and some buildings and some shops. But try and kind of excavating onto that. And as I say, do it in a fun way. Have local exhibitions, develop a petition, get people to sign, that kind of thing. That's just kind of off the top of my head, but you need to get the hard information. That matters. So who is this person that owns these properties? Yeah? What are their legal structures? Get their company accounts. I'm doing a big investigation on a very significant landowner in this region and what they've been doing in far, far away places. It's quite interesting. So quarry away.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Hi, my name is Boy. I would just like to know if any of this is actually going to improve social housing in the area, because there's a lack of it, and social housing would probably help the working class man, help him feed his family a bit better, because and even the housing that is available out here is pretty poor. The housing I was in for 4 years was very poor, and this man actually to the left of me helped me, he probably won't remember me, to try and get my council house, but I had to get my own merits to get one. And I think the housing situation, not just in Midlothian, but the whole of Scotland is absolutely terrible, and these landowners are sitting with millions of pounds worth of land, and they don't care about the working class man. it's about time people out there started to help the working class man.
I would agree. I think housing is one of these really pressing issues. And as I say, if you go to Belgium, if you live in Belgium, the municipality's got the power to acquire land for housing. And if you go to the local council office, there are plots for sale, 20,000 euros. And co-ops use the power of local municipalities to acquire land for housing and then build houses cooperatively. And the main barrier here, which is one of the key barriers, and planning is an issue as well, but the kind of price and availability of land has been resolved in most of continental Europe. And I've said to government ministers that all you need to do, it's never quite that simple. You know, there's money, there's planning, there's land, etc., there's the law. But if you stood up, so if Nicola Sturgeon stood up and said it's no longer acceptable that anyone should have to pay more than £10,000 per housing plot, right? So that's housing associations, councils, private owners, whatever. That would revolutionise housing in Scotland, because people would suddenly be able to afford to build stuff, and I'm talking housing associations, local councils, etc. And one of the critical things here, right, and this is where getting into this detail matters, is in the 1950s, a law was passed in the wake of a court case where a local authority in Wolverhampton, I think, was wanting to use compulsory purchase powers to buy land to build something. I can't remember what it was, housing or a cinema or a hospital or something. And they said we shouldn't have to pay more than twice its existing use value. So this was agricultural land. It was worth, I don't know, well in today's terms, maybe, I don't know, £5,000 an acre. So they said we shouldn't have to pay more than £10,000 for this acre of land. And the court said, and then the law was passed, saying no, you have to pay the new use value. So if you wanted to use this land for housing or whatever, obviously it multiplies in value by 100 or 1,000 times. Now that was never the case in Germany. After the war in Germany, for example, where they had to rebuild the country, the idea that municipalities and local government have to pay astronomical costs to house the German people who, you know, were in a state of destitution after the war was ridiculous. So in Germany, you pay 2 times the existing use value if you're acquiring it through compulsory purchase for housing. The Scottish Law Commission is consulting on new law of compulsory purchase. The whole basis on which land is valued is part of that consultation. If we can reverse that 1954 Act or whenever it is, we could revolutionise what councils and housing associations can do in respect of getting hold of land. So there are no easy answers to all of this, right? But I actually happen to think that is an easy answer. It's just harder. Oh, can an easy answer be harder? But you know what I mean? We can actually deal with this kind of stuff. It just takes a little bit more effort than historically we've been perhaps prepared to do.
At the back there.
Could I just follow up the answer
Sorry,
with some information?
Can I just ask, there are people who have their hands up who have not spoken. I would really like them to speak. So
it's just in response to the gentleman with the affordable housing.
Could you please sit down, sir?
I'll talk to
Could you please sit down, and this lady here, thanks.
We've heard quite a lot about community groups getting together and getting informed, which sounds fantastic, it's really empowering. Is there anything on the other side of it, though, where there's guidance at all for businesses or people who, say if you've got a scenario where somebody wants to build a factory or something and create 500 jobs, you know, but there's communities against it or what have you, how do you, are there any examples of where in other countries where maybe commercial interests and local interests can actually come together and everybody's happy? I know that sounds a bit, you know, is there, because I'm all for the, you know, land reform and community involvement, but there must be situations where maybe, you know, if there's going to be job creation, there's going to be conflicts on all sides, and you know, how do you deal with that in other countries that are a bit more advanced?
All I would say very briefly is that in most other European countries, as I say, there's much more local government, and so people tend to be engaged in these discussions at a much earlier stage and more intimately.
And do you find that businesses in that are
that's what we're talking about. Yeah. And you know, municipalities will, you know, will compete to attract. But the point of our democracy is it is because it's remote. and kind of far away from us, relatively speaking, to the rest of Europe, it means that business interests or investors find it easier, not that they necessarily want to do this, but they find it easier not to have to engage with the local, because fundamentally they don't actually need to. Yeah? So I think that's key to it, and you do find, yeah, you've still got the same kind of conflicts all over the place, you know, in land and...
That's what I mean, it does seem like a conflict, and I just wondered if there was any sort of proactive approach with business to say, look, this is a better way of doing it with communities, or something, you know, just rather than them just coming in and then we all object.
Yeah.
You know, is it a way that they could proactively, you know, show good social responsibility, sustainability? Is it a model that we can help our show businesses, you know? So I'm just thinking at it from both sides, that's all.
It probably is.
Yeah.
It seems to me what you're talking about is there a structure within which people and businesses can come together?
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah.
I don't know what to say. Answer to
Yeah,
that.
I don't know of any examples in other countries, but I think, I mean, certainly they can work together, but I think I would never wait and expect businesses to go for the social responsibility thing. You have to make them do it. You know, you have to make them do it in law. And part of the, you know, the legislation coming out saying that you need, you know, community consultation at the very first level. But you know, when you say that to, even those words, you say them to people and people go, oh God, because it's where community especially is one of those words that New Labour destroyed, you know, it just doesn't mean anything. And there's PR companies that come in and do the consultation, and it's very much like, wait there while we consult you, right? And then we'll go away and completely ignore what you say, because there's no onus upon them to do so. So while I wouldn't say that there's necessarily always this massive conflict and there can be no conciliation. Of course they can bring jobs to the area, but they need to do it in such a way that actually benefits people in the area. And at the moment it's just so lax that they just don't have to do that, and they can get away with absolute murder, which usually happens.
Yes, sir.
My name's Barry Turner. My question is, how can we apply our community force in a productive way, whether it's to change laws or to bring about or and instigate the same things that lobbyists do with local governments and what have you? How could we counterbalance that effectively in a I suppose an organised fashion, in a more organised fashion? Because that tends to be what happens. We are kind of in a disarray community. They are well organised. They're switched on. They have the lawyers in place, the people to actually put the legislation forward, and we are not lawyers and don't understand legalese to the full capability. So how can we obviously scale them up as well? That's a part of that process. I don't want to become a lawyer to enable myself in my community. I want to apply the force that I do have, and obviously garner that. What's your thoughts on the best way to apply that? Because I think that's really, everybody's talking about a similar thing. It's about what can we do, what can we participate in. Obviously we're doing it now, but what's the productive way of doing things to get things to happen and change?
I suppose there's kind of two ways you go, right? And there's joining the community council or be it going straight into those democratic structures and applying your force through those structures. And it's whether or not you find that to be productive, right? Because there's an argument to say that community councils are so weak that it's almost counterproductive, because you get stuck in a bog and people's sort of talent and their enthusiasm just dissipates, because they're supposed to be weak. You know, they're not an empowering body at all. And really, like as Andy was saying, our local democracy structures are so far removed from us now. The ones with any bite at all, any power at all, are so far removed, especially in rural Scotland. They're so ridiculous. That there's an argument to say that, you know, I know a lot of councillors and community councillors who are great. I mean, they really go for it, but it just takes all their time and it just sucks the life out of them. It can be really, really hard. So you've got that route, and it's, you know, yes or no. And then there's this sort of banding together and being more of a campaigning force in your community. And I suppose there's lots of different organisations. One thing I've noticed, like working with 38 Degrees, when I go down to England, I'm the only person, staff member in Scotland, and when I go to England and we do like local groups meetings, everyone's like, oh yeah, how do I join up with this? Whereas here I've found people, they're already part of so many groups. And that's, I think that's sort of part of the referendum thing, but sort of there's like Commonweal and REC and Women for India and all these groups where people have come together just for a broad desire to see change. And it doesn't have to be a yes-no referendum thing at all. I think it's just that people have become activists, which is great. And yeah, you get into organisations like 38 Degrees, you have to get people coming around one certain issue, and then sort of different skills come out and different kind of leaders emerge, and you get a big network of people, and then people continue to campaign around other issues that come up. So there's definitely lots of different avenues to go around it. And it's, I'd say it's quite an exciting time to be in Scotland, definitely. Like people in England, my colleagues are quite jealous, like they want to move here, you know.
I would say just very briefly, I work with a lot of communities where there's a lot of inefficiency. There's a lot of groups all kind of crisscrossing and stuff. I think you need to kind of network very effectively, have sort of strategic plans, like for a year, 2 years ahead, what are our targets, what we're going to do, break down the work, you know, that kind of thing. I think a lot can be achieved by much more efficient working together.
Before I get anybody else to speak, one of the things that we recognised is that there are pockets within Midlothian who are active and they want to challenge, whether it's you know, whether it's on land reform, whether it's on fracking, whether it's challenging the local plans. But one of the things that we've recognised is that there is no umbrella organisation that captures all of that. And that's one of the reasons we've come up with Midlothian Matters. And what we want to do with Midlothian Matters is separate it out from Women for Independence, because we need to have the whole community and not just the strong women who are standing up here and saying, come on folks. We want everybody to come under that umbrella of Midlothian Matters so that we can see what's happening in the communities, what are the issues that are hitting communities, what are the issues that can be campaigned on, what can we work with the councils on, how can we change the structures that are not working for us. These are all the kinds of things that need to happen from within the community itself. We cannot wait for the council to provide all the houses. We cannot wait for the council and the government to change all the laws and the structures. What we've discovered in the last 6 months is people actually have to start doing this for themselves. And that's what we're asking, is that the whole community comes under this umbrella of Midlothian Matters, and your wee pocket of your wee community of however many hundreds of people can work within and have the resource of this whole community, because Midlothian is one of the most beautiful counties to live in, and yet it is dying because there's huge poverty, there's land that's not being used, there's huge land ownership issues, etc., etc. So, having said that, any other questions, please? Yes?
Yeah, I just wondered if you were aware of any surveys that have been done on people's experience of submitting comments on planning applications, because I certainly find it very confusing, very complex, not easy at all, and it seems like that's other people's experience as well. And I just wondered if there have been any surveys or any evaluation of people's experiences of that.
I don't know, but there's an organisation called Planning Aid Scotland who've done quite a bit of work, so they may well have done some studies.
Democracy.
Sorry, have you got a question?
Yeah, I've got a question as well. I just wanted to ask, my name's Joan Higginson, by the way. I used to live in this area and I live in East Lothian. And I was a strong campaigner against the A701, and we did win that battle, and I have a lot of information that could help the campaign that's going on about the road at the moment and the landowners that live in that area. But I'm wondering if we should still be going for a third party right of appeal. What's your opinion on that?
Yes, the organisation you mentioned was what?
Planning Democracy.
Yeah, sorry, I think that's maybe what I meant. Sorry, yeah.
Could somebody else answer this?
Oh, sorry, your question was third party right of appeal.
Third party right of appeal, do you think we should be fighting on that level again? Because
We lost out the last time round, and that was a
So
big
this is
deal.
the ability of people other than the applicant in a planning
Yes.
case application to appeal the decision of the local
It's supposed to be
authority.
that you don't have any rights.
I think there should be a third party right of appeal. How that's framed is has to be subject to a lot of detailed debate. But I think there should be, to balance, to have more greater equality of arms, if you like.
There was a really interesting article in Scotsman a couple of days ago about an open letter that was sent by a lot of different organisations calling for the establishment of an independent arbitration body, because there's been so many like controversial planning things over franking and over other stuff that have been eventually, you know, the company has appealed and the council's thrown up its hands and it's gone to ministers, and then like shady stuff happens and you wait, you know. so the establishment of an independent body, I think, would be a step forward.
Yeah, especially with big developments like the film studios, they're just lumped in with everything else, with everyone's, you know, conservatory or cutting down a tree, and this wasn't even in the local development plan, I don't think, and it's just very easy to pass people by, because the website itself, you need basically a degree in computer literature to understand it, and you know, I have had some experience with that, and it's very difficult to get through. So any huge developments that are going to be massive, they need to be in the local development plan, and they need to be much more on the surface for local residents to appeal on in the very early stages.
And also, just to add about your group, I mean, there's a group of us, and Bonehead and the Damhead Community Council, they are actually fighting together. It's called West Midlothian Action Group.
Any other points? Oh, sorry, I've not spoken. Like speak. Ruth.
Yeah, Ruth. I'm just wondering whether there's a feeling as a gap, and that has to do with measuring of well-being, because whether it is the business with common interest or the individual different sections of society interest, there is some common thing we share, which is health and well-being. And the way how the government, from Westminster at the moment, is issuing policies which are utterly uneconomic, as we all know, in the name of economy, that doesn't make any sense. And something unique is in Scotland, and I don't know how many people know this, if you go back to the Gaelic roots of it, and maybe there are other picture roots as well, but you could not think of ownership. You always think of husbandry or of taking care of. It's in the actual indigenous language of this land. So I'm just wondering whether you would know anywhere something. I know from the Falkirk Against Unconventional Gas, that group there has the first UK community charter, where the community got together and used an amazing process. And I know that there are other groups, like Portobello, I think is one of them, and others who are trying, in the connection with the fracking issues, to get this charter going. How can we as a country who do not have a constitution to actually say there is the pin needle against which we measure well-being and true values? If I look in terms of the tree, so we've got a tree over there, and you maybe really can tell a bit more one day, is our roots are our values. So how can we get together to do this? You got anybody an idea?
So the question is, how do you measure well-being within Scotland or within this community?
How can we get together in order to have a common ground for the measuring of well-being, which is economic?
I mean, boringly, so you can to an extent, this just sounds boring, I mean, you can to an extent have that in your planning policy, which the Scottish Government's new planning framework sort of makes vague, sort of vague noises about having this. So, you know, you have to have social well-being, and you have to start thinking about like they've actually been paying attention to the late Elsa Mackay and her. There's more about women's view of the economy, but it's the same idea of we can't measure everything against GDP. What does GDP even mean? And there have been encouraging noises from the Scottish Government about recognising that and bringing it into legislation. And when you're talking about planning, you can have that as a principle that you adhere to in your planning considerations. And I think it takes time because it's a culture shift of moving those, you know, getting those ideas into a mainstream and making the sort of GDP ultimate thing being very much challenged whenever it appears. But I'm quite encouraged about hearing this coming out quite a lot in the mainstream political scene in Scotland at the moment. Certainly not in the UK though, definitely.
Okay, can we have one last question, please? One last question. Yes, sir.
Thank you. Your obvious reluctance to let me speak is
I think you had quite a lot to say in the beginning, so I was giving other people the opportunity.
The discussion's moved a little bit from land use and land reform to other social questions of equal importance, but the gentleman over here raised an important land use question, which seems to merit comment. He asked a question about affordable housing and the lack of it, and the response from Andy was, with respect, rather misleading, because you talked about the reluctance of landowners to give over land being stuck and not being sold. That simply isn't the case. Any farmer with a spare field would bite your hand off to sell his land for housing. Every local authority has a quota for affordable housing, but most local authorities don't comply with the quotas and try to find ways out of them. The discussion widened, ma'am, to a wider question about democracy. Scotland is one of the few countries in Europe where you can lift the phone and speak to a cabinet minister. Mr. Neil, who is the Minister for Communities at the moment, Cabinet Secretary, in the last 2 or 3 weeks has called in 8 large housing applications in 8 different areas of Scotland. I'm talking 200, 300, 400 houses, in order to force local authorities to apply their affordable housing quotas, usually 25%, but not always. And he has said, as it happens to me personally, but it could have been anybody, I will force these authorities to meet these quotas, and I'll go on doing it until they do. So he's called those in for his own decision. Now this was an election promise, and he's fulfilling it. I'm not an SNP supporter, but it seems to me that that's a pretty short road to a democratic solution to a problem which you have carefully identified.
If I would just like to interject here, I believe Bill asked the question about social housing rather than affordable housing, and I think that there is so much being said about affordable housing, and we can see these sprouting up all over Midlothian, cheap housing for the masses, and we've already been down that route in the 60s, and I hope, for goodness sake, that we're not recreating that kind of situation. But one of the things that is really important that seems to be getting forgotten about is, yes, we need affordable housing, but we also need social housing. We need rented accommodation that is reasonable, where the rents don't keep getting hiked up for the benefit of a small number of people.
Well, I think that's what this gentleman was actually talking about.
Okay, so I'd really like to thank Andy, Jeff and Charlotte very much for coming tonight. I'd really like to thank you all for coming as well and supporting us. If you would like to have other meetings about other things, please let us know, because we'll organise it for you. Thanks again.